This is Reverse Engineered.
Hey everyone, my name is John Penland, and this podcast is brought to you by Kinsta, a premium managed hosting provider. In today's episode, I'm talking to Jonathan Williamson, CTO and co-founder of CG Cookie, Blender Market, and Mavenseed. Jonathan, welcome to Reverse Engineered.
Hey, thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, it is our pleasure to have you here. So, to get us started, can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
I can try. So like John said, my name is Jonathan Williamson. I co-founded and still have a large role in running CG Cookie, Blender Market, and Mavenseed. Yeah. All three of these companies are intricately linked, but for the most part, it all starts with CG Cookie. So basically, we run a 3D animation training platform for teaching game development, visual effects, 3D printing, you name it, all based in the software Blender. Blender Market then is the marketplace to go with that for selling professional assets, resources for Blender. And then Mavenseed is a whole another topic underlying the CMS that we may get into later, but it's a little harder to put that into a direct pitch.
Yeah. So usually my next question, which you've already answered a little bit, is to ask folks to tell us about their particular company and venture. In your case, you're doing a lot of different things, right?
Yeah.
So I do also know that, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I want to give you the chance to speak about all your different ventures. So I know that in addition to Blender Market, CG Cookie, and Mavenseed, you're doing some other stuff. So let our listeners know what else you're working on.
Yeah, well, so like a lot of people that, kind of grew up immersed in the tech world and, still spend my entire professional career behind the laptop for the most part. Sometimes it's really nice to get away from the laptop completely. And I also co-founded a small brewery, which is actually where I'm sitting now. So being a small craft brewery, one of the best parts about it is that there is almost no software involved. I mean, obviously there's software involved, from marketing and recipe design and all that. But in short, it's my creative outlet for creating a truly tangible asset that doesn't have a return on investment for the customers coming in the door. It doesn't have anything like that. There's no churn rates. There's no lifetime values. No, it's I make beer, I sell the beer, people enjoy it, and I try and keep it pretty simple. So that's my sanity in the professional sense when I get tired of technology.
Right. It's your balance to all the technical online work that you do. That's awesome.
That's exactly it.
All right. So backing up a step, there's CG Cookie, there is Blender Market, there's Mavenseed, there's your brewery as well. Where are you spending most of your time right now? What's your primary focus?
So my primary focus is Blender Market. So within, for anybody listening to try and clarify, basically we have CG Cookie is the corporate company. Okay. CG Cookie then owns CG Cookie, the education platform, Blender Market, the marketplace, and Mavenseed, the CMS. Sure. So when we're talking about CG Cookie, the company, that's the whole team involved. But my focus is Blender Market. So, and Blender Market started in 2014, originally as a side project for the company. Sorry, just had a phone go off in the background. Yeah. So Blender Market started in 2014 as a side project for the company, and everything that we've done has been bootstrapped from the beginning. We definitely try to take a slow and steady approach to it. And that one was definitely slow. Sure. Okay. Steady, but slow to begin. Yeah. And it's not slow anymore. Sure. Which is a good thing, but it means that it's taking a lot of my time.
All right. Okay. So
that's my core focus.
Nice. Okay. So just to make sure I've got the picture straight in my mind, you have CG Cookie, which is both a company and a platform. Yep. And then CG Cookie is the parent company over Blender Market and Mavenseed, and this is
that's exactly it.
Not tremendously important. Are Blender Market and Mavenseed, are those actual separate business entities, or are they just products of CG Cookie?
They are separate business entities owned by CG Cookie for the most part.
All right. So now you said your focus is on Blender Market. So I assume there are other folks who are focused on CG Cookie and Mavenseed. Do you have some co-founders, business partners in the mix as well?
I do. So on CG Cookie and Blender Market, I've got one co-founder. His name's Wes Burke. He's actually the original founder of CG Cookie. He started it shortly before I joined, and then we really kind of solidified it. And he basically leads CG Cookie. I lead Blender Market, and then on the Mavenseed side, we actually brought in Nick Haskins as a third co-founder, who was also one of our key employees for C2 Cookie. And so between the three of us, Nick leads the development efforts, I lead Blender Market, Wes leads C2 Cookie, and then we all kind of, balance Mavenseed a bit.
Yeah. So if you are CTO, does that imply that you focus on technical? Because it sounds like what you're telling me is that for Blender Market, you're all things to all people. Like you are the product, or you are the mastermind behind Blender Market right now.
For lack of a better word, I'm CTO because we didn't know what else to call me.
Okay, all right. I hear you. Yeah.
Like a lot of small teams, we all wear a lot of different hats. We've all kind of grown into the roles that we are now. And sometimes, I can say flat out that between Wes and myself as the original co-founders, we never really put a whole lot of weight on titles and roles. We just did the work that we needed to do.
Yeah.
As the team has grown and everything has grown since 2008, there's some reality checks come into play, and so technically I'm the CTO. I do everything. I dabble in just about everything.
Yeah.
And
no, I'm familiar with that phenomenon.
Yep.
when I joined Kinsta had 15 people, but even at 15 people, definitely several of us were wearing a lot of different hats, and there was a time at which I was doing everything from working in customer support to sales to client care, basically anything interacting with a lead or a customer I was involved in. I was also doing legal, and I was helping out with finance, and basically the only things
sounds pretty familiar.
the only things I wasn't doing was was writing code. And that may be about it. Writing code and marketing. I wasn't writing code, and I wasn't involved in marketing. But aside from that, I was touching everything.
How many people is Kinsta now? I remember it's like 200, right?
It's not quite there. We're at about 160, I think, right now.
Nice.
So nice. I do expect we'll be at 200 before long, because we're hiring fast, particularly on the technical side. So
that's awesome.
So coming back to Blender Market, CG Cookie, they're both oriented, or they both operate within the 3D animation community.
Yep.
As you've already described, and I want to just reiterate for our listeners, Blender Market and CG Cookie are actually closely linked, right?
They are.
Yeah, I want to let you speak a little bit. Well, go ahead and speak a little bit to that. What's the relationship between CG Cookie and Blender Market?
So ultimately, the relationship is this. CG Cookie teaches you how to use Blender, the animation package, to produce 3D animated content, whether that is for 3D printing, medical visualization, games, visual effects, you name it. At this point, there's a much shorter list of things it can't do than the things it can do.
Right. Yeah.
And CG Cookie teaches that. That's all we do is we teach Blender. It used to be that we also taught 3D Studio Max and Maya and Modo, ZBrush, but ultimately, where in the last couple of years we've actually come back towards we started because of Blender, and then we branched off to try and diversify that a lot more, and ultimately we've come full circle and now have just embraced the fact that we are a Blender training platform. That's what we do.
Yeah. Nice.
Cool. Blender Market, on the other hand, is then solely focused on allowing professional Blender artists, developers, creators, etc., to actually sell those professional resources, add-ons, scripts, you name it. So in short, CG Cookie will teach you how to do it. Blender Market allows you to build a livelihood around it.
Right.
Or at least a component of a livelihood for some people.
How did you first get into the 3D animation space yourself? Did you get in just as a personal interest? What was that? How did that happen?
Yes. Well, it happened when I was 12 or 13. I'm 32 now, so I'm coming up on 20 years. And it really was a family friend that knew that I was always into art. I was always into computers, and he was super involved, or at least very passionate about the early open source projects. And in this case, it was a small one that I don't even know if it still exists, but it was called Freecraft, and it was literally just an open source recreation of StarCraft, the game. And they were looking for artists, and it was like, well, Jonathan likes art. Jonathan likes computers. Hey, you should try Blender. I had no idea what I was getting into. At the time, Blender looked more like a a really, really bad avionics panel, maybe. Like, I mean, the UI was horrendous. The amount of options was daunting, but
Sure.
I started dabbling in it, threw it away,
Yeah.
got my interest peaked again about 3 months later, downloaded it again, and never stopped
Nice.
for a while there. So this was when I was about 13. I was spending about 8 hours a day on it.
No way. Wow.
And dove into the deep end very quickly.
Well, and that has to beg the question, right? You're 12 or 13 years old. How are you spending 8 hours a day on
I was
3D
unschooled.
animation? You were, say that again?
I was unschooled.
Okay,
So
nice.
I never had any formal education until I reached high school. And my parents had basically afforded me the opportunity to just spend as much time as I wanted. You know, I think they were pretty nervous about how much time I was spending on the computer at the time.
Sure. Yeah.
But ultimately that was something that they decided to permit, and we had a computer in the house, and
Yeah.
that's what I did.
Right. Well, and I have to ask. So, as the parent myself of a 14-year-old who spends a lot of time on the computer, he's deep into the Linux community, and his current
Cool.
his current interest is not is it was spurred by folks in that community, but it's ham radio. So
Awesome.
what advice would you have? I was not, when I was 12 and 13, I was not spending 8 hours a day on the computer the way that my son is. And I'm allowing it, but I do have that same nervousness that maybe your parents had. So I'm curious, how do you reassure me as a parent about letting my kids spend that much time on the computer?
You know, because I've talked to my parents about this too. You know, I now have a young son. He's going to turn 3 in a couple of months, and you know, my wife comes from a very different educational background than I did, and so obviously we're starting to have those conversations of like, well, you know, what route do we go? What do we want to encourage, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, what it's come down to for me, like looking back at my own experience, and obviously everything, you know, is you know, rose-colored glasses, and like, you know, I only see the best of it, and but ultimately, I think what my parents afforded me, even if they didn't realize it at the time, was the time and ability to just figure out what I was interested in and just pursue curiosity with, you know, no, obviously within reason, but basically no limits.
Right.
You know, if that was exploring drawing, 3D animation, programming, I had the time to just be curious. You know, I didn't have a schedule to follow. I wasn't being graded on any of the work that I was doing. It was just my curiosity leading the way, and ultimately that has played out in my entire life. And that everything that I've done, professionally and personally, you know, even when it includes CG Cookie, Blender Market, Mavenseed, Sandhills Brewing, etc. Every single one of these has been because I became curious about that thing. And obviously it's not just me, you know, I've got co-founders and I've got a team, but in terms of like that initial spark and the interest, is all of that was based on curiosity. You know, there was never a point in any of these endeavors where I thought, I need to start a business. I need a business plan. I need a way to pay the bill. No, it was, well, this is something that I'm interested in. Let's just do it, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. So I guess, you know, that would be my suggestion, is that, you know, curiosity, both in the professional sense and in the educational sense, is probably the single most powerful thing a kid can have. And the last thing you want to do is stifle that.
Right.
And, you know, I don't want to, without getting too into it, I don't have very good feelings about the way our public education system is set up in the sense of enabling and empowering curiosity.
Sure. So, and I'm curious. So you said you were unschooled, and then did I catch correctly? You transitioned into a more typical educational setting in high school.
Yeah. So my brother and I both decided to. So it was our call. I think my parents at the time were probably pretty against it. I don't think they wanted us to go to school at that point.
Yeah.
Just particularly, my dad has some pretty strong feelings on the way that, at least in our area, the way the schools were set up. But ultimately, my brother and I, we were just looking for, you know, we wanted to try something. Something new. And so we we enrolled in one of the local public high schools for our sophomore year, graduated 3 years later as
Nice.
as seniors,
Yeah.
and loved it. Like
Yeah.
there was plenty of problems to it, and I think
Sure.
had I done that in middle school, I think it would have been awful.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
one of the advantages of starting in high school was like I had already kind of figured out, for the most part, who I was, what was
Sure.
important to me, and what I wasn't going to put up with.
Yeah.
And so I just got to kind of take the best of it and leave all the crud behind.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Obvious. I didn't know this about your background in unschooling and that whole transition. It's a very close parallel to some of the decisions we're making right now.
Oh, really?
Particularly with my oldest. He's 14. He's been homeschooled, but there's a lot of freedom in that, and he spends a lot of time working on his own projects. And he has expressed an interest in going to a regular school next year. So we're trying to navigate that.
Is that from a social standpoint, or wanting to fit in to just have more exposure? Or?
I think it's social, right? So he was in a co-op type organization, and the organization didn't have enough kids at his age group to continue putting together a group at his age group. So the younger kids still participate in the co-op. He is entirely on his own, and having done the co-op for a couple of years, which was only 1 day a week, it was just Mondays, but having done that, he's like, all right, I actually kind of liked having friends and seeing people. Now, he does other stuff, he swims and he does some other stuff to interact with folks. It's not like he's at home all the time. But it is, I do think it is largely about, just the social aspects.
Honestly, I think, looking back, I think that was the best thing I got out of it.
Yeah.
And because I've always kept a pretty small friend circle. Let me know if background noise ends up becoming an issue. I can move to another room.
Okay.
I've always kept a pretty small friend circle, just out of preference. I'm very introverted and very okay with that.
Sure. Yeah.
But some of my closest friends of all time, still to this day, 15x years later, all are from high school.
Yeah.
And so I think, the social value there is very hard to understate.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So,
well,
but of course that's not the truth for everyone.
Yeah, sure. So I had actually started, we went down a nice little rabbit trail. I had actually started with the question of how did you get into the 3D animation space? And the answer was that you picked it up as a 12 and 13-year-old and just started playing with it, and you had the time to invest in it because you were unschooled, so you had this time to invest in it. I'm curious, you're 12 or 13, you're learning how to use the software, you're getting really good at it. How does it transition from being just something you're interested in to something that you're building projects around? Like how do we go from 13-year-old Jonathan who knows how to use Blender to the guy who's jumping on board with Wes Burke at CG CG Cookie?
So I think it was so I started dabbling professionally in Blender at 15.
Okay.
And one of the, I had started doing a couple of little freelance projects for commission and whatnot. But my first real commercial project was I produced and sold a training DVD, when DVDs were still the hot thing.
Yeah.
And I don't actually know what started it, other than I originally produced a free tutorial that I published online. Which publishing at that point, of course, was very, very different than it is now.
Sure.
YouTube was hardly a thing.
Right.
And that I just released it for free, just for fun, and it got a lot more attention than I expected it to. And I think that's what then led to doing the full training DVD. And I actually worked it into a high school project where it was.
Okay.
I guess that's my second one. Somewhere along the line, I worked it into my high school senior project, where I was supposed to, spend a semester working on something. And so I spent all my high school hours literally recording training videos and then packaging up in a DVD and then sold the actual DVD online. And that was my first real taste of a commercial endeavor of sorts.
Yeah.
And I basically used that as the starting point for basically building a freelance business around doing video tutorials and training and whatnot, which directly then resulted in doing the very first work with Wes Burke, my co-founder, because he had started a little 3D tutorial news site called CG Cookie, and he'd never even heard of Blender, but he was paying people to produce tutorials for it. And I sent in a tutorial request. I think he went, what the hell is Blender? Sure, whatever, I'll do it. And it worked really well.
Nice.
And then we did another one and another one and another one. And well, now here we are.
So originally you were a content creator on CG Cookie, which Wes was running. So you were the original Blender content creator.
Yep, I was.
Okay, interesting. And so then at some point, I guess, Blender became the driving force behind CG Cookie, and Wes said, why don't you just come on board? Or how did that happen?
So, from literally the very first tutorial, it was very apparent that there was a need to be filled in the Blender world that hadn't been met when we started publishing tutorials on CG Cookie. Keep in mind, truly at this point in time, CG Cookie had no idea that it was going to become a Blender site. Like Wes definitely didn't plan on that. In the beginning, I had no plans of, becoming a co-founder in a big project like this. It just organically happened that way. And really what it was is that Blender was growing very quickly. And I think in 2008, it was already one of the most used 3D softwares out there, just in the terms of the user base, in part because at that point in time, all other 3D animation software, the big ones being Maya, 3D Studio Max, Lightwave, Houdini, etc., all of these were very expensive proprietary tools that were used exclusively by professionals, and particularly professionals in the context of a studio. Freelancing as a 3D animation artist was barely a thing at that point. If nothing else, it was mostly relegated to small time amateurs. And nobody could afford that software. It was think the closest parallel I can make for people not familiar with the 3D world is Photoshop. How many people 15 years ago using Photoshop professionally actually owned a legal copy of Photoshop? Far fewer than we'll admit. And so Blender was the alternative for that type of scenario. It was like, if you didn't want to pay for an expensive license or couldn't pay for an expensive license, you could use Blender. Now, at this point in time, you got to remember that Blender was it was almost a professional embarrassment to say, I use Blender and I produce 3D animation. It was, it was looked down upon by the entire industry, by professionals. And so what we had, without even realizing it at the time, was we had this huge group of people using Blender who couldn't get inroads into the established industry because they were using Blender, but they couldn't get inroads because they couldn't afford the licensing, and there was nobody producing content for it. And so we came along and started producing these tutorials and just discovered by chance that, there's a lot of people here looking for content, looking for interest. And we just, I'm not even sure we consciously realized it at the time. But we embraced it and just went with it. And it was, I think, about 2 years later, so I think 2010, we launched Blender Cookie. In other words, just a subset of CG Cookie focused exclusively on Blender. And that was about the point that we decided, all right, this is it. We're going all in. And
I'm curious because one of the things you said a little while back is that when you were, a teenager, a young teenager, you had the freedom to pursue things that were interesting to you. And that's really where you developed this initial interest in the 3D animation space. And I get the impression that as an older teenager heading into probably into your early 20s, you can basically continue to exercise that curiosity as you're putting out tutorials now. And so you're really exercising the same skill set at a time when most of your peers are taking on educational and financial liabilities that don't let them pursue those things. And so I'm curious, was that an intentional, well, let me back up and say, did you find ways to maintain the freedom to pursue your curiosity after high school? And if so, like what are the sorts of choices you were making so that you had the time to pursue things like writing tutorials and investing your time in something like CG Cookie as opposed to, working 10 hours a day for minimum wage somewhere?
Good question. Yes, I don't, I never consciously made that decision,
Sure.
but the reality of it was that by the time I graduated high school, I was already earning for a 18-year-old pretty good money doing my own work, both
Yeah.
on a commission basis, selling my products, etc.
Nice. Yeah.
And then through partnering up with Wes Burke, then I was, producing content on a paid basis.
Yeah.
And at that point, before we actually established the company, it was a very simple, like I would create a tutorial or I'd submit a tutorial idea. He would greenlight it. I'd produce it. I'd deliver it to him. He'd pay me. And then we just, kept that rolling for a while. And so I think I unconsciously enabled myself to continue pursuing that curiosity because I wasn't bogged down by a 9-to-5 job or a part-time minimum wage position.
Yeah.
And that I think some of the proof of that is I have quite. It sounds. It sounds like I'm tooting my own horn when I say this. I don't mean it this way, but I've literally only ever held one real job.
Yeah.
And that was I was a Media Lab assistant for the Kansas State Research and Extension Office at K-State University in Manhattan, Kansas.
Yeah.
And even there, because I was the Media Lab assistant, everybody in the lab, which in this case was basically 3 people, it was my boss, myself, and one other Media Lab assistant, basically meant that we were recording speeches, we were recording, seminars, we were managing the website, publishing recordings onto the website, digitizing scans from research and extension offices. We were producing custom graphics for the video intros. And so even in that, I was sneaking Blender into that work.
You're developing the same skill set.
Yeah.
There. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like, to my boss's credit at the time, who I'm still in contact to this day, he was very patient and lenient, and also like, a classic case of as long as I got the work done that I needed to do, he didn't care what I did the rest of the time.
Right. Yeah.
And so the reality is I spent the rest of the time learning Blender, learning Photoshop, sleeping at my keyboard sometimes.
Sure.
But that was literally the only non-self-employed job I've ever held.
Right. Right.
And so in that sense, I was still pursuing that curiosity even as an employee.
Right. I think the thing that strikes me is that, intentional or unintentional, you didn't find yourself in a position where you're having to balance the demands of, I want to launch this venture, but I also have to pay my bills. It doesn't sound like you ever found yourself, which I think is awesome, for somebody who got started coming straight out of high school, or is that a challenge that you've had to balance at different times?
I mean, yes and no.
Okay.
I never really had the problem of having to choose between a paycheck and pursuing the venture, in part because my paychecks have always come from those same ventures. I would rephrase the question like, has my ability to pursue those ventures been limited by cash flow? Absolutely.
Sure.
Many
right,
times.
right. Sure.
But I think just because of the circumstances, ultimately, at the end of the day, the interests that I was trying to pursue were the same ones paying my bills. And so it actually worked out well, particularly when I was a college kid living in a dorm room or an apartment, very few obligations financially, legally, etc., that I could just work 16 hours a day. And I don't condone that. That was, not the healthiest decision of my life.
Sure. Yeah.
But I had the time.
You had the ability. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to shift a little bit and go back to something you were talking about earlier, which was that when you first came into the picture with CG Cookie, you're putting out these Blender tutorials, and you guys recognize there's a huge community here that's underserved, and where making a living off of these assets is difficult because this tool at that time is not recognized professionally necessarily in the way that it might be today. And I'm curious if that was a part of the motivation. I don't know where in the timeline Blender Market came into the picture.
2014.
But I'm struck that if you have this audience that is that's developing these assets, but they're having a hard time making a professional connection with the deployment of those assets, that that maybe Blender Market's the answer to that problem.
Well, and ultimately that was the chance that we were taking when we decided to do it, because we believed it was at least a answer to the problem.
Sure.
I would rephrase it a little bit and maybe touch on why we started Blender Market to begin with, because and really what it was is Blender Market Blender being a open source product in the same way that WordPress is an open source product. There has always been this kind of tug and pull between the commercial interest within Blender and the open source free with no exceptions side of things.
Right. Sure.
And this goes into the classic, free as in freedom and free as in beer discussions.
Right. Yeah.
And at the time, so this was 2013, before Blender Market, I had become really frustrated with the state of add-ons in Blender, plugins, for lack of a better word.
Sure. Yeah.
Because what would happen is Blender had a pretty good Python API, and you could write custom tools in it, improve your workflows, etc. Just like any other plugin for any other software, you could go beyond what the base software added, and it was great. There was a lot of people doing really, really cool things as add-ons that were very applicable to what I was doing and what other people were doing, but they didn't necessarily fit into core Blender. That wasn't on the Blender Foundation to maintain and release for everyone. But the problem was that they were free, they were open source, and they kept falling into disarray because Blender has always followed a very fast development cycle, and like any other modern software, the API changes, and you have to maintain your software. And so what would happen is people would release these add-ons that'd be amazing, and you'd want to implement them into your professional workflow. And 3 months later, a new version of Blender would come out, and the add-on no longer worked.
Right. Sure.
And what we didn't have in the community at that time was, intrinsic motivation for those people that are releasing these add-ons to maintain them, because frankly, the vast majority of these add-ons that were released for free to the community were done as just little tiny side projects or experiments, or somebody would say, "Hey, I have this problem on the forums. Is there anybody that can help?" And then somebody would just pipe up and say, "Oh, well, here, I just wrote a little script for you."
Yeah.
Sweet. That's great.
Right.
But then 3 months later, the script no longer works. Right. You as an artist have no idea how to go in and fix it. Sure. And the person that fixed it has their own, full-time day job, and they can't be bothered to fix it. So what I saw as not just as the opportunity from a business sense, but a need that needed to be filled within the community, was to give creators, specifically developers, since most reusable models, graphics, etc., those for the most part just keep working. Software does not. Software needs constant maintenance. Sure. And so I thought that there was a real need for people to have, economic motivation to maintain their software.
Sure.
And I had gotten so frustrated with it that I said, "Fuck it, I'm gonna do this."
Yeah.
And so I commissioned somebody to write a tool that I'd wanted, because I was not a coder at the time.
Yeah.
I barely consider myself a coder now. So I commissioned them to do it. They did it, and then I sold it. I sold it as a commercial plugin.
Okay.
And I got a lot of vitriol for that.
Yeah. That's funny.
From a very small subset of people, but there was a lot of people pretty upset that I was selling open source software.
Yeah.
But it worked. And that product still exists to this day in a slightly different form on the Blender market.
Yeah.
And it was the test case for if there was enough people willing to spend money on a Blender tool to use in their workflow. And the answer was yes.
Yeah.
And that number has just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow.
Right. So that's really fascinating. So you guys you're running the CG Cookie website, and you have this audience there, and you see this problem of the animations continue to work, but because of the development speed of the software, add-ons fall into disrepair very, very quickly, and there's no motivation for creators to maintain these products. So you ran a test case, you put out your own commercial add-on to see if, just to have a proof of concept, and then said, all right, well, let's create a marketplace that will provide financial incentive to developers who create add-ons for Blender.
Yep.
So that they'll maintain the software. Is that kind of
that's exactly it.
Wow. Okay. So that's awesome. So really then, again, Blender Market is kind of this add-on to CG Cookie, or not add-on, but it is a project running.
It's a complementary business.
There you go. Yeah. You got two complementary businesses operating side by side. One provides education, the other provides a marketplace, both operating within this community. And I'm curious, you've already touched on it a little bit, where, when you first released this, commercial add-on, you got a little bit of vitriol from maybe some purists within the community. I'm curious how much time you spend thinking about how to maintain the right relationship towards this community. Like, is this a community? Is this something you invest a lot of time in, or are you just so deeply embedded in the community at this point that your websites, your projects are just part of it?
I don't know how to answer that, actually.
Okay. Right.
I think your second half of the question is closer in that,
Well, let me back up and ask the question a different way.
Sure.
So the way that I first formulated the idea is, how did you attract the community to these projects? Because I know you had CG Cookie and you had the community coming there, but it's a leap to ask people who are used to operating one way to say, let's embrace a commercial model for this software that has not had a commercial model in the past. Was there an intentional strategy around getting the community to make that leap from purely educational to saying, we're going to embrace a commercial model within the Blender community?
No, I don't think so, because we had already done that with CG Cookie.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So, pre CG Cookie, I was mostly releasing tutorials for free on the community forums. And then I sold my first training DVD and then another one.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'd already reached that gap already. I'm basically saying, hey, me, Jonathan Williamson, I'm creating this content. I'm giving a lot of stuff away, but I also value my time. And if you're willing to buy a copy of this, I will invest my time to create it. So I'd already done that. And then with CG Cookie, early on, our business model has changed 3 or 4 times for CG Cookie. And in the very beginning, everything was free with the exception of source files. Okay. You could purchase the source files for a couple of bucks and you'd get the models, the textures, the, downloadable video, et cetera, which, by the way, is a terrible business model. Nobody pays for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And then we went from there to selling individual courses. And from there, we launched a subscription model, as subscription models were starting to take off. And so I don't think it was a very big leap for us to go from CG Cookie to Blender Market, because we'd already reached that gap of the commercial divide. Now, I'll tell you, early on, like, those same purists that were like, how dare you sell open source software, et cetera, felt the same way about selling educational content that used open source software. And they felt that all content should be free.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So were you already, and I might be getting into the weeds a little bit too much here, but it strikes me that there's a distinction between selling software and selling assets that you've created. So because I know you sell, not you sell, but on Blender Market, you don't just sell add-ons, you sell all sorts of different assets for people to use in their projects. was there a distinction within the community between, this is okay to sell, this is not okay to sell, or was it simply a matter of your audience was ready for that transition?
I think there was a distinction at first. I think now the community has grown and evolved enough to recognize that what you're selling is your time and your commitment to support and maintenance more than anything.
Absolutely.
When I sell a copy of our software, I'm not selling you the code.
Yeah.
No, I'm selling you a guarantee that I'm going to support your use of that.
Right.
And I lost my train of thought.
That's all right. That's all right. All right. So the question was, was there a distinction between, or did those who gave you a little bit more trouble about selling, did they make a distinction between selling software and selling creative assets?
So not in the beginning, later on, yes. So in the beginning, it was, how dare you sell anything around Blender? Like, what would the foundation think if you were selling their products? Or selling content around this free thing that they've created?
Yeah.
Early on, there was no distinction.
Yeah.
Later, as basically educational content became understood and appreciated, the selling of software products was where the focus was, because they're basically saying, hey, this code is open source.
How can you sell it? Right.
And I know, WordPress obviously went through all of these same discussions and everything.
Yeah.
The parallel that I've always drawn between the Blender world and the WordPress world is that basically WordPress, from a commercial sense, was about 8 years ahead of Blender.
Yeah. It sounds about right, because these do sound like the same types of conversations that were had several years ago in the WordPress space. That's interesting. So,
do those still happen in the WordPress world?
They do. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody necessarily argues too much about the idea of selling, code anymore. But yeah, they do still. I think the big push right now is to make sure, or not the big push, but the conversations that I hear now are primarily around licensing and around building services and products around WordPress, and how far does the GPL reach, right? So outside of the core itself, how far does it reach? And at this point, I think probably it's a little bit different in the WordPress space, because Automatic and Matt Mullenweg, one of the two original developers of the WordPress software, because they've embraced a commercial model, right? So I think that has affected the conversation to a degree as well, which they're
kind of leading the charge.
Yeah, a little bit, and so when you have that happening at that level, it becomes a lot less controversial for somebody else to sell code.
Sure.
I
definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. These days, the primary conversations that I hear or that I see and occasionally participate in are around licensing and how far does the GPL reach. So
sure.
All right. So we're just talking about WordPress. So I am aware that at this point, I don't think your projects are built on WordPress. We've been talking about WordPress a little bit. You guys have really developed your own CMS internally there, which you refer to as Mavenseed. So I'm just curious how this project grew out of the other projects that were happening.
Sure. So everything, C2 Cookie, Blender Market, and Mavenseed are all built custom on Ruby on Rails.
Okay. All right.
And so Mavenseed is basically the refined version of the CMS that we built for C2 Cookie first. Yeah. And a lot of the pieces and parts that we learned for Blender Market.
Okay.
So at this point, Mavenseed does not power either Blender Market or C2 Cookie.
Interesting.
It will power C2 Cookie. Okay. So basically what we're doing right now is, early on, we started on WordPress, and, from 2008 to 2016, I think. Okay. We were on WordPress.
All right.
And then we decided to go to a custom platform and built it on Rails. And we started it by building the Blender Market, launched that, and then we built C2 Cookies as well, and learned a lot.
Sure.
Blender Market was literally the very first Ruby on Rails project we had ever done. And some of the problems with it being our first project are still alive in the code base today.
Yeah. Sure.
But one of the things that we learned very quickly was that, ultimately for CG Cookie specifically, as an education platform, we're not really doing anything unique. Anybody that is creating video content, text content, etc., and releasing those to one-time customers, subscribers, you name it, they all for the most part have the same needs.
Yes.
There's very similar products out there, Podia, Teachable, they've all realized the same thing. What we realized is we already have it.
Yeah.
Let's just license it for other people to use.
Sure.
And so that was originally what we were going to do, is we were just saying, hey, let's just let people use the CG Cookie CMS. And then as we started exploring that, we're like, no.
Right.
This thing is broken.
Right. That was going to be my question, did you take the software that you were using and just release it? And it sounds like you're saying flat out no.
No,
that didn't happen.
We flat out started from the ground up and said, okay, if we were to build CG Cookie today,
how would we do it?
How do we do it? Yeah. And that's what we've done. So so that is Mavenseed, and we are selling that, as a standard SaaS for anybody to use. So if you want to, sell one-off purchases, if you want to sell your, ebooks, a newsletter, course subscriptions, you name it. If you want to sell digital content in just about any format, you can do it on Mavenseed, complete with community and everything else. And what we are doing right now is we are basically building Mavenseed for ourselves. So we have, millions and millions and millions of records in the CG Cookie database. And we have gone through and basically said, all right, what are we keeping? What are we not?
Sure.
Well, here's all the functionality that we need to build inside Mavenseed. If that functionality needs to be built such that it's available to everyone, or maybe it's a more of a niche use case, all right, we'll build it as a plugin. And so for the last year, we've been building Mavenseed for ourselves in the lens of allowing anybody else to use it. And we will actually be switching the CG Cookie platform over to Mavenseed in the next couple of months. And it's a lot of stuff.
I mean, and it strikes me that so I have a couple of thoughts. One, I was talking to somebody else, and they referred to what it sounds like you're doing as commoditizing your byproduct, and I loved that line. They were like, we have this byproduct that we're creating through our work, and so we're going to commoditize that. And I need to give credit. It was Shane Perlman, the CEO of Modern Tribe, who said that. And so it's an interesting approach. I think it's potentially incredibly valuable. But what I'm struck by is that with CG Cookie and with Blender Market, you're in a very targeted market, and Mavenseed has the potential, I think, to be a much more broad application, right?
It does.
And so as you think about these different projects, and I know your focus is primarily on Blender Market, but Mavenseed is under the CG Cookie umbrella here. How do you think about Mavenseed in the long term? Do you view it as a small sub project, or do you guys view Mavenseed as long term? This is going to be a really huge part of what we're doing.
I think that Mavenseed, if we play our cards right and are patient enough, Mavenseed stands to be dramatically larger, more successful, and more flexible than Blender Market and CG Cookie can ever be. Because of the generalized audience. Blender Market targets Blender creators. CG Cookie educates Blender artists. Mavenseed does not pick and choose, which is the best and worst thing about it. Nice thing about being targeted in Blender, it's very easy to target our audience. There's like 3 community forums. There's one group on Twitter. It's very easy. And particularly because, I've been very involved in the Blender community my entire professional career. That's not hard.
That's easy for you.
I don't think I ever really appreciated how freaking hard it is to attract an audience in a space that nobody knows who you are. That's really difficult. And so I guess, for us, Mavenseed is the long game. I mean, C2 Cookie and Blended Market are both long games. So like we've always taken a slow and steady, what do we want to be doing in 10 years approach as opposed to what has to happen now today.
Right.
So we definitely see Mavenseed as that, that it has the ability to be the core of the business, at least as far as our offerings go 10 years from now. But it also, maybe more importantly for us, is how we see as a company our ability to make an impact and also create some longevity when we are not as actively involved. One of the things and one of the downsides, for example, on CG Cookie is very content driven. CG Cookie fails when we no longer have the energy, the ability, or the means to produce content for it.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah.
Mavenseed, on the other hand, and Blended Market kind of fits in the middle here. Mavenseed, so long as we maintain the platform, we don't have to produce content.
Right.
So it's, and that's not to say that there's less work on the platform. No, there's a ton of work. It's very different work.
Yeah.
But, rather than saying, hey, I'm going to sell you my content, we are saying, hey, I'm going to enable all of you to sell your content, and I'll just take a small piece.
Yeah.
And that's been, the big thing that we've learned from Blended Market too, is that CG Cookie scales based on the amount of effort that we put into it directly.
Sure.
Blended Market scales based on how many people we enable and incentivize to put their own time into it. And so, for example, Blended Market has gone from the very first year that we started it, 2014, we processed on average $12,000 per month processing.
Yeah.
And then we would take a commission out of that.
Sure.
Last month, February of 2021, we did 480,000.
Wow.
Processing. And that's happened in 6.5 years, basically is where we're at now.
Yeah.
We didn't pass 100,000 a month until I think, I'm probably going to get my dates wrong, but I think it was April of 2019.
Yeah, I was say it can't be that long ago, because I looked at the total revenue and it's like 7.8 million has gone through Blender Market since it was founded in 2014. And if you did 480 back in February, again, just doing kind of some back of the envelope math here, I mean, you guys are pretty close to doing your total revenue almost at a monthly run rate right now.
Well, so I just pulled up our actual numbers.
Yeah.
So the very first time that we hit 100, so we did 100,000, 157,000 in 2015.
Yeah.
480,000 in 2017.
Yeah.
And in February of 2021, we did 484,000.
Right. So more than you did the entire 2019. Is that right?
2017.
2017.
In 2019, we processed 2 million, almost on the dot.
Yeah.
And we're a quarter of the way there in 1 month.
Yeah. That's amazing.
And the reason that I think in the context of this discussion, why that's important is simply that we didn't market to all of those people.
Right.
We didn't bring all of those people in. No, we brought the creators in, and then they brought their own audience.
Yeah.
And that ultimately that's what we're trying to do with Mavenseed too, is we want to enable the small business owners to come in, and then they bring their customers in, and then we all win.
Right. Kinsta's taken a similar approach. Now, obviously we don't have necessarily folks reselling content on our platform, but what we do have are agency partners or developers who use our platform and they bring their customers on board, and it is very much a similar trajectory. I don't have numbers in front of me, but it is a similar trajectory where if you look at number of new customers that come in the door today, and then look when I started, we have more new customers coming in the door every month than our total customer base when I started in 2016.
I believe it.
Yeah. So it's the same. It is the same type of. I feel like that you reach a sort of a point of critical mass where the you do have to continue to develop, to put out a quality product or quality service. Like that can't suffer. You have to continue to deliver the goods. But if you can continue to deliver the goods, your existing customer base really becomes what propels you forward, more so than any specific efforts you're undertaking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Particularly in a platform like service,
Sure.
where all of your customers are incentivized to bring in their own customers because they succeed even more when they do.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
I will say, we never managed to crack that with the C2 cookie side. There's obviously, gazillions of words can be said about affiliate marketing and the value or lack thereof, depending on the business model and whatnot.
Sure.
But I will tell you that referral-based marketing is so much harder when you are the content producer and the platform.
Sure. Yeah.
For sure. We never managed to crack that with the C2 cookie side.
Yeah.
We tried.
Yeah. Right.
And tried.
Yeah.
And tried. And never did.
Right. All right. So I've mentioned Kinsta, and we've talked a little bit about WordPress. A lot of our listeners are going to be coming from that WordPress space, and I would be remiss not to mention that you do have a brother, Pippin, who is very well known.
Checked.
What's that?
Last I checked, I've got one.
Yeah, last you checked, yeah. He's a very well-known plugin developer. Lots of our listeners are going to know who Pippin Williamson is. So while you guys have very different businesses, it is interesting to me that you're both entrepreneurs and you're both in the open source software space. And I'm curious, do you think there's something about your shared background that nudged you both in this entrepreneurial direction?
Without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah. What was that?
I'd say it was two primary things. One is our dad is a custom database developer.
Okay.
So he works in FileMaker. And so, growing up, we always had computers around. We always had computers in the professional sense. I have so many memories growing up where our dad would be like, no, you can't install games on the computer. That's my work computer.
Right. Yeah, there's no way. Yeah, this is not a toy.
Right.
Yeah.
So early on, there was always this association that, not only are computers fun and cool and all that, but they're incredibly, work and productivity based. You can get work done and you can make a career on the computer. So there was that. But the other one is that early on being probably 2003, 2004, maybe when we were 12, 13, something like that. We both got very heavily involved in Lego Mindstorms. So we were building Lego robots. Yeah. And we discovered pretty quickly that at the time, this would have started with the third generation Lego Mindstorms, with the first ones with the yellow brick. Yeah. They had a built-in programming language that was all drag and drop, and it was awful.
Okay.
For one, we were a Mac household from day one, and it only worked on Windows. So that was a problem. But we discovered, I don't even remember how we found it. I think we probably got the same guy that introduced me to Blender also introduced us to NCQ, or NQC, not quite C, which was a C adaptation for Lego Mindstorms. And you could program your Mindstorms in C on a Mac, and then download it to the Lego block. I forget what it was called, the RCX or something, via an AR sensor, and it allowed us to really explore and fall in love with true programming. Yeah. Super early on, and so that's awesome. We started building fun robots, and I think the best one we built was it was a pool robot where you could have a remote control, and it would just go up and it would grab a pool ball, and then you could drive it off and you could drop it any ball you wanted. And we built it specifically because we were in something called Science Olympiad at the time, and they had a challenge of, hey, you have to build a robot that can put all of these pool balls within the time limit into their designated pockets. And the faster you can do it, the faster, the more points you get, et cetera. Right. So that's what we did. Yeah. And we would have won if he hadn't picked up a block. Very nice. So there was you could remote control him, you could do whatever you wanted, but you could not touch the board. And literally on the very last block, a piece fell off the controller, and just through instinct, we go to grab it, and like, oh, instantaneously disqualified.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think that, that was really our introduction to all things software and programming.
Sure.
And
Yeah. So you're in a household where you see, your dad is working with databases, and you see, computers being used for work, earning a living on a computer. You're developing technical skills. I feel like there had to be a piece there where you guys were also encouraged, and I'm just guessing here, but it seems to me that there had to be a piece where you guys were encouraged a little bit to be nonconformist or independent or something along those lines. I mean, am I striking in the right direction there? Is that sort of an attitude that was instilled at a young age?
I think my dad probably gave you some hints.
Okay.
No, I mean,
yeah.
absolutely. You're spot on.
Yeah.
Anyone that has ever met our father will
Yeah.
learn very quickly that he is the most non-conforming person.
Okay.
And I mean this in the best, most loving way possible.
Nice.
He's very, very independent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And he always considers himself the black sheep of just about anywhere he goes.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't fit in. Never
Right.
has.
And he's okay.
Would rather not.
Yeah.
And he's very okay with that.
Yeah.
And I think he definitely rubbed off on us a lot in that sense, in that we've always just kind of said, well, I'm just going to go do this thing that I'm interested in.
Right. Yeah.
And
yeah.
of course
yeah.
that has some downsides.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, we were never, and definitely never had it instilled in us that like we had to follow a traditional career path
Right.
or an education path or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's helped a lot because, basically there are no preconceived notions for us.
Yeah. 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 I agree. I mean, it does sound like this combination kind of put you guys both on a path, you and your brother, of we have these technical skills, and growing up, you have the time to pursue your own interests, and then we're not going to the traditional go to college, get a good job. It doesn't sound like that ever held any sway.
No. I mean, I think I will say that there was some pushback there, though.
Yeah.
And my dad will be the first to admit it, because, he had, he basically had two main sayings that he loved. One was, that I am not, my dad's name is Mike. It's like, it is not my job as a parent to raise a little Mikey.
Yeah.
No,
sure.
I'm raising a Jonathan and a Pippin.
Yeah.
You guys have to forge your own path.
Mm-hmm.
But he really, really, really wanted us to be biologists.
Oh, that's so funny.
Because he's a biologist.
Yeah.
And he actually even admitted to me the other day, he's like, yeah, I really struggled with that for a long time because I felt that I had failed as a parent because neither of you guys became biologists.
That's
and
hilarious.
Frankly, don't even have we have a deep appreciation for science and biology in particular, but never felt passionate about biology.
Never wanted to pursue it educationally. Yeah.
No, not even remotely.
Funny. Right.
And it was literally just like 2 weeks ago, he told me, I finally came to terms with the fact that I had not failed by you guys not becoming biologists. But it took him 10 years.
Right. Yeah, you're both successful independent business owners, but somehow he had failed because you didn't turn into biologist, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
So for me, I dropped out of college.
Okay.
So I went to Kent State University and dropped out after my sophomore year. And I know for a long time that, I think because of the biology aspect, that, my parents would never tell me this directly, but I'm sure that they were very worried, like, what? Why are you dropping? Like, don't do that.
Right. What do you
don't
just
do that?
Finish? Yeah, just finish. Then you can go do your thing. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. I hear you. Interesting. Fun. Okay. All right. So I do have a question for you about advice based on your experience in, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur. So let's say that one of your friends came to you. They've got an idea for an online business. They're really excited about it. And they say, Jonathan, what advice do you have for me as somebody who's about to launch my first venture? What do you tell them? What are some pitfalls to avoid or best practices to instill early on?
Can I curse?
Yeah, go for it.
Just fucking do it. Okay. That honestly, that's what for me, what it's come down to is and this basically goes back to the classic, anybody that spends a lot of time in software, particularly online software, will hear this over and over, like, get your MVP out.
Right.
But
Yeah.
really it's just do it.
Right.
And I realize that is a very a privileged outlook.
Mm-hmm.
I fully recognize that I was very privileged in that I had time.
Yeah.
I had enough money to start, partially because of the fact that I had time.
Yep.
And I had family that was very willing to let me explore those things.
Yeah.
Fully recognize that. However, I have a lot of friends that have wanted to do this and expressed, basically asked for that same type of advice. Yeah. And then we'll spend years analyzing their business plan carefully and decide is this the thing that I want to do? I've got this whole thing laid out. I've got the corporate structure figured out. I've got the products designed. Yeah. I know our path to market. I know all these things. Yeah. And yet they don't have anything to show for it.
Haven't pulled the trigger. Yeah.
Right. And ultimately you don't have a business until you sell your first product.
Right.
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So sell your first product.
Right.
Get it out there.
Yeah.
Even if it falls flat, you're going to learn more falling flat on your face than you will trying to plan out 10 years ahead before you ever sell your first product.
Yeah.
Because you're assuming that you're not secretly, Apple Incorporated, and you're slowly making a very smart strategic move with existing resources, assuming that you're actually building your business from the ground up.
Right.
You don't have the luxury of time that way. Yeah. You also are just spinning your wheels answering questions that you don't actually know what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just dive in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was not part of Kinsta's founding team. I joined after they'd been around for about 2 years, but that mirrors Kinsta's founding in a lot of ways. Kinsta was born over a weekend as an idea. They just threw up a landing page.
Nice.
And then initially, the first customers that that came through the door, if you needed support, it was an email, right? Like you were emailing info@kinsta.com or whatever. Yep. And as far as setting things up, they just manually were setting up VPSs. There was no interface. There was no control panel, right? Like it was just, we know we want to do this. Let's see if we can attract some customers. Yeah.
It's the classic example of doing the things that don't scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think that the inverse of that is what paralyzes so many people without them even realizing it. Is they're like, well, I have to have this whole team in order. I've got to figure out, the support structure and all of that. But because basically so many people are planning ahead based on, well, if this gets to where I want it to be, and suddenly I'm making several $100,000 a year selling this product that I've designed, then you're going to need those structures probably. Yeah. But you sure as hell don't need them.
Right. You don't need them today. And if you don't ever have any customers, you never need them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the best way to prove whether or not you actually need to put in all that time is get those first customers.
Yeah.
For one, it's obviously very daunting getting those first customers. One, just because it feels impossible. Like, how am I ever going to convince somebody to buy my product the first time? Yeah. But it also becomes very daunting because once you get them, you have an obligation.
Right. Now
and that's really stressful.
Right. Now you got some responsibilities to live up to.
You do. But one of the best things that I don't think enough people recognize is there is almost nothing that you can't change.
Right.
Sure. If you launch a product
right.
and then realize that you completely failed in some form or another, or you discover that the way you were doing support doesn't work, you discover the pricing was wrong, whatever it was, just change it.
Right. Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And if you need to go back and tell your former customers, like, hey, I'm so sorry that I way overcharged you.
Right.
Have that conversation.
Yeah.
People are very, very understanding when you don't try and pull the shade over their eyes.
Yeah. Right.
Sure. If you don't intentionally, or at least appear to intentionally deceive them, people are pretty great most of the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So just go ahead and do it, and then be upfront and honest about what's going on with your customers.
And it's okay to fail.
Right.
Really
That's okay too. Right. Nice. Okay. All right. So as we wrap our conversation down, I do have 2 questions to wrap things up with. So the first is, do you have a resource that you would recommend to our listeners? So this could be a blog, a newsletter, somebody that you follow, a book, Is there anything that you would go, listeners to this podcast should check out this thing?
There's a couple that I would recommend.
Okay.
And my recommendations are always changing. Maybe not as often as I would like recently, because I haven't been reading nearly as much as I would like.
Sure.
I love to read.
Yeah.
I'm just not, in the last few years, I haven't been very good about reading.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely an admirer of Basecamp, the company.
Okay.
Specifically,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
specifically Jason Fried,
Mm-hmm.
and David Hannemeyer Hansen, both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And actually both for two very different reasons. Well, a particular reason for each of the three.
Okay.
As a company, I really appreciate, and full disclosure, we use Basecamp products.
Okay.
But Basecamp's approach, particularly in the tech world, to saying it's okay to slow down, I really value.
Sure.
And to particularly, I think a lot of companies have probably discovered, the value of remote work and the fact that it's possible and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But to then see all of these things that Basecamp in particular has basically been a thought leader on for the last 10 years,
Sure.
to suddenly see those things forcefully put into action because of COVID,
right. Yeah.
has just, to me, been a great testament for how thoughtful they've been over the last 10 or so years, and basically committing to say, we can build a better workplace and be more respectful of people's time and energy, and to realize that at the end of the day, we work because we're interested, but ultimately we work so that we can have a lifestyle.
Yeah. Yep.
And that, yes, there are people that would choose their job over the rest of their life if they had to choose one or the other. But for the most part, there are very few people out there that are going to say, you know what, I think I would rather keep my job instead of my family.
Right. Absolutely.
No, your family comes first, yourself comes, like all of those things. And so having a workplace that's built specifically around those policies and respect for that is awesome. So in long way to answer that is, they released a couple of books, specifically Rework, and a couple others that are just, they're awesome.
Yeah.
They're to the point, they're short, and they're also very broad.
Yeah.
And so then the other two that go with that then would be, Jason and David are the two owners of Basecamp.
Mm-hmm.
They bring very different attitudes to the table.
Sure. Yeah.
David is great at just saying, fuck it, this is the way that he's so succinct, so abrupt. Right. But very refreshing in that sense.
Sure. Yeah.
And then Jason is the opposite, where he tend to be, so much more calm and not more thoughtful. They're both very thoughtful.
Yes.
But in, I guess, careful in the things that he says.
Sure.
For the sake of thinking through it very deeply.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so I value that a lot, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And so if you haven't looked at them, their resources they're awesome. They're really good.
Okay. Awesome.
There was another one that I was thinking of that's completely unrelated, but
Yeah.
I can't think of it. If it comes to mind, I'll shoot you an email on it. And
Okay,
if you want to put it in the show notes or something like that, then you
Awesome.
can.
Yeah, we'll do that. So last question to take us out. So if you were going to direct folks a place to connect with you, or the best place to learn more about CG Cookie or Blender Market, where would you send them?
I would send them to jw3d.com.
Okay.
It's my personal site. It's very short.
Yeah.
I am awful at updating my personal site.
Yeah.
I would love to be writing and doing all that. And I've just discovered that I just don't do it.
Yeah.
And so instead, JW3D is just a very quick bio and a link to each of my projects.
Perfect.
And from there, each of them can be discovered in full.
So jw3d.com.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to chat with me today.
Yeah. It was fun, John.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, looking forward to seeing this live.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that is it for today's podcast. You can access the episode show notes at kinsta.com/podcast. That's kinsta.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Reverse Engineered. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or the platform you're listening on right now. See you next time.